Good morning. This is actually a Dharma talk I've looked forward to giving because the topic is, I'm deeply passionate about it. So I'm happy for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Our environment is clearly in crisis. Species extinction at an alarming rate, unprecedented climate change, melting glaciers, a myriad of chemicals and microplastics in our air, water, and bodies. These things and more are truly cause for social and scientific, as well as moral alarm. Untold human suffering, indeed the suffering of all living beings and the very destruction of our environment, is on the horizon. Civic and governmental bodies seem paralyzed in the face of needed action to effect the changes that must happen if our planet as we know it is to survive. So what are we as individuals to do? Clearly, recycling our soda cans is not enough. Lately, I've been thinking that perhaps Buddhism has a unique perspective to bring to the discussion of how best to find our way forward. Our ecological crisis is more than a technological problem or an economic problem or a political problem. It is also a collective spiritual crisis and a potential turning point in the history of our planet. In the West, much of our ethical framework is based on individual rights and entitlements that place human interests at the summit of ethical concerns, an orthodoxy that can be traced back to the so-called Age of Enlightenment and thinkers such as René Descartes. Dubbed the father of modern Western philosophy, Descartes' bifurcation of all things in existence into either mind or matter led him to conclude that nature, lacking mind, had no value except for human use. Philosophers have also linked the emergence of an exploitative attitude towards the environment in the West to the medieval Christian ethos of human supremacy over the world, with humans being seen as the crown of creation and the center of the universe. By contrast, Taoist philosophy takes a holistic view of the world and seeks to apply to our lives the understanding that the separate parts of the ecosystem function as a whole. This goes deeper than just understanding biological systems, for it becomes an ethical foundation for seeing the realm of humanity as only part of a greater whole, a whole on which our very lives depend. In Western philosophical thought, even the field of environmental ethics tends to see the environment as something external to ourselves. But to a Buddhist or a Taoist, that notion is simply an illusion that leads us to believe we are separate from everyone and everything else. Additionally, a fundamental concept in Buddhism is that of dependent origination, which teaches that an entity does not exist and generate independently, but rather each entity exists only in relationship to other entities. Master Sotaesan, our founding teacher, was deeply influenced by Taoism in the development of Wan Buddhist philosophy and scripture. This brings to Wan Buddhism a strong emphasis of living a simple and balanced life in harmony with the natural world, what some call deep ecology. As Master Sotaesan said, the source of penalty and blessings is not God or the Buddha statue, but the treatment of all things, either with or without respect. We disciples of the Buddha should treat all things in the world with respect 24 hours a day, walking, standing, sitting, or reclining. Respect is the way, the Tao, of according with nature will. One of my favorite contemporary Buddhist writers on the environment is Professor David Loy, an American scholar and Zen monk who is deeply interested in exploring the interface of Buddhism and ecology. He calls this eco-dharma and posits that our dukkha, or our suffering, is caused by the delusion of our sense of a separate self. He thinks that the United States is likely the most individualistic culture that has ever existed, and that we are adrift in a secular world that tells us our suffering can be fixed with things like material possessions, social status, sex, or power. Our culture's real religion is consumerism, though in Chapel Hill it might be basketball. A fundamental teaching in Buddhism is that there are three poisons: greed, hatred or anger, and delusion or ignorance. In the United States, our economic system has institutionalized greed. The military has institutionalized hatred, and our media have institutionalized delusion. Dr. Loy outlines three components or aspects of Buddhist eco-practice. 1, practicing in the natural world. 2, exploring the eco-implications of Buddhist teachings. And 3, understanding that eco-activism is needed today. With regard to the first one, practicing in the natural world, he says that the importance of meditating in nature is often undervalued because its implications are often overlooked. Religious founders have experienced their spiritual transformations by leaving human society and going into the wilderness. Following his baptism, Jesus went alone into the desert. Muhammad's revelations occurred when he retreated into a cave where he was visited by the Archangel Gabriel. Perhaps the best example, however, is Gautama Buddha himself. After he left his royal home, he lived in the forest, meditated in nature, and awakened under a tree next to a river. When Mara questioned his enlightenment, the Buddha didn't say anything but simply touched the earth as a witness to his awakening. Afterwards, he mostly lived and taught in the natural world, and it is said that he also died outdoors under trees. With regard to Dr. Loy's second aspect of eco-dharma, what he called exploring the eco-implications of Buddhist teachings, so many Buddhist teachings have obvious ecological applications. For example, a life preoccupied with consumerism is clearly incompatible with the Buddhist path. Also, that basic precepts begin with the pledge not to kill or harm life, not just human life, but all sentient beings. Additionally, the most fundamental principle of ecology, the interdependence of living beings and systems, is one of the most fundamental principles of Buddhist philosophy, as I mentioned earlier. The principle that nothing has self-existence because everything is dependent on something else. Additionally, Buddhism is kind of interesting. It's the only one of the major religions that is not pro-natalist. There's no scriptural exhortation to produce more children. Lastly, how do we assess that third arm of eco-dharma that Dr. Loy was talking about? Understanding that eco-activism is needed today. In addition to an enhanced understanding of our relationship to the environment as individuals, how can we join with others to bring about change? How can Buddhist teachings help us to be better eco-activists? Several things that are inherent to Buddhism come to mind. 1, non-judging, not separating opponents into good people versus bad people, and not othering those we disagree with. We're all in this together. Seeing others as our opposition greatly hinders progress in any discussion about how best to proceed. 2, nonviolence. This is a strong tradition in Buddhism and has always included nonviolence to the earth itself. 3, being pragmatic. Not getting caught up in fruitless debates, but rather seeking what works. In Buddhism, our texts are not sacred or revealed from on high. Rather, they are guidebooks with an emphasis on skillful means. This helps us to understand the need to seek practical solutions. And lastly, non-attachment. In this case, non-attachment to outcomes. It's a sprint. It's not a sprint. It's a marathon. You can't think about the ultimate goal all of the time, just the next step. As Buddhists, we can do our best, not knowing if anything we do makes any difference whatsoever. Our efforts are a gift to the earth. Not being attached to outcomes is very difficult, but the Buddhist practice of meditation is what gives us a foundation for non-attachment. I know I talked a lot earlier about the perniciousness of Western philosophy, but perhaps in the West, we have a unique opportunity because of a longer history of democracy to go further, to find ways to change social structures and to change the harm caused by our institutions. Political action is needed to ensure that we all work together for sustainable usage of our natural resources. When Buddhist practice is applied to our political efforts, generosity can be our motivation. Goodwill and compassion can be our guide. And learning can replace our rush to judgment. Guided by these wholesome qualities, political action can be passionate, energetic, and effective. We can improve the quality of our environment while we deepen the capacity of our hearts. Buddhism's emphasis on equanimity is not incompatible with political action. Rather, it discourages divisiveness, hostility, and self-serving in bringing about political change. Our ecological crisis is as much a spiritual challenge as a technological and economic one. So, what are we to do? First, reawaken your own awareness of the planet. Remember that the very first of our fourfold graces, the foundational doctrine of Won Buddhism, is gratitude to heaven and earth. And truly hold in your heart that idea at all times. What does that mean? Heaven and earth is, as Master Sotasan said, the universe without which we cannot live. And with that renewed awareness, take action both in small and large ways. Open your windows and turn off your air conditioning. Don't buy anything if you can find it used. Be mindful of the energy required to manufacture something and then to dispose of that something when you're through with it. Don't buy anything if you don't truly need it. Take all that money you'll save and use it to help put photovoltaic panels on the south-facing roof of the temple. I mean, this is a perfect roof for PV panels. Completely stop using plastic straws, plastic bags, and plastic bottles, and tell people why you stopped. Carpool. Press your legislators to get behind public transportation. Get rid of your clothes dryer. Only buy natural fabrics like wool, cotton, linen, or hemp that don't shed plastic microfibers into our water supply when you wash them. Eat fewer mammals. I could go on, but y'all already know all of these things. Write your governmental representatives on environmental issues. Take 5 minutes to write an email. Right now, for example, there's a plan being formulated in Orange County to mandate PV panels on all county government buildings. I only know about this because of my work with a local NGO called NC Warn. Email the county commissioners to voice your approval. Show up at a county meeting in support. They respond to citizen pressure, and they need to hear from you. Five or 10 years ago, in my neighborhood on Joe Mack Road, very close to here, a small group of neighbors got together. We pooled our money and hired Strata Solar to put up a solar array. Our investments, only a few $1,000s each, were mostly recouped in 5 years through grants and tax credits. Though it produces only enough power for 1 or 2 houses, it stands as a demonstration project for what people can do, what they can accomplish when they work together. Perhaps your neighborhood could do something similar. There's a book entitled, it's a long title, Blessed Unrest: How the Largest Movement in the World Came into Being and Why No One Saw It Coming. It was written in 2007 by Paul Hawken, a writer and environmentalist. He argues that a vast, what he called, movement with no name is forming all over the world, involving nonprofit groups dedicated to environmental, social justice, and indigenous rights issues. He estimates that perhaps 2 million organizations have arisen independently as part of a worldwide phenomenon. He sees it as a sign of life stirring in the beaten up bowels of the planet, part of the Earth's own immune system. Well, that concept struck me initially as a little overly idealistic, but I have thought about it a lot, and I think there may be something to it. I went online to try to figure out how many environmental organizations there are in North Carolina. There are hundreds. There are groups and there are coalitions of groups. Since there's so many different lists in different organizations with different approaches to a variety of environmental problems, it became impossible to count. I found over 20 just in Durham. There are groups working on sustainable energy, wildlife protection, air and water quality, plastic pollution, land conservation, sustainable farming, and goodness knows what else. I'm personally acquainted with a few. The Eno River Association and the Duke Lemur Center are doing great work. Did you know there are more lemurs in Durham than there are in all of its native habitat of Madagascar? The hope is that someday, through habitat restoration, we can repatriate those lemurs back to Madagascar. NC Warn and Interfaith Power and Light are 2 organizations doing awesome work on sustainable energy. I love the Southern Environmental Law Center. They have an office here in Chapel Hill. If you don't already, perhaps you can consider engaging with and donating to an environmental organization on a regular basis. When I was in school here in the 1960s, the Haw River was horribly polluted, largely due to the many textile mills along its banks. Today, however, it is teeming with wildlife, and nearly every section provides a pleasant place to take a walk. In large part, this is due to the mills shutting down, but a nonprofit group called the Haw River Assembly is actively responsible for much of its protection today. Try spending a day on the Haw. Take a lunch. Sit on one of those big rocks in the river and meditate. You may find yourself inspired to join the Haw River Assembly, or check out any other environmental organization whose particular goals appeal to you. Thankfully, there are myriads to choose from. Bring your Buddhist skill set to the table and work for effective change.